A lot of people keep asking me why their Native American DNA isn't showing up, even though they know they have Native American ancestry, or there's a long-standing tradition in their family for having Native American ancestry. And that's what I want to talk about in this video presentation. Hi, my name is Dardette, and I hope you will subscribe to my channel, click like or dislike on this video, and let's talk about why certain ethnicities show up on your DNA test and while others don't, even though you know that you have that ancestry or you have a really strong indication or a family legend that you have such and such an ancestry, but it's not showing up. So I've entitled this presentation, Where's My Native American DNA? Let's get some basic terminology out of the way. A chromosome is a thread-like structure of nucleic acid and protein found in the nucleus of most living cells. It carries genetic information in the form of genes. Now, what's a gene? A gene is a section of DNA in a specific location on a chromosome that contains information which determines a particular trait. But wait a minute, what is DNA? DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid, and it forms building blocks for life. Your DNA contains the instructions on how your body works and what traits you will or will not have. We also need to talk about what an allele is. An allele is a variant form of a given gene. Sometimes different alleles can result in different observable traits. In genetics, a centimorgan is a unit for measuring genetic linkage. It's defined as a distance between chromosome positions for which the expected average number of intervening chromosomal crossovers in a single generation is about 0.01. It's often used to infer the distance along a chromosome. However, it's not a true physical distance. The most important aspect of shared centimorgans is the length, or the size of the shared DNA segments, and the total amount of DNA that's shared. So what's a phenotype? A phenotype is a set of observable characteristics of an individual resulting from the interaction of genotype with environment. Most of the time, a physical trait is the result of a bunch of genes working together. Sometimes, though, a single gene can be responsible for many traits. Other times, single traits can be determined by a single gene. So for every pair of chromosomes, we get one set from each parent, which means we get two sets of variants, or alleles. One will be dominant and one will be recessive. Dominance simply means that an allele masks or suppresses the one that is recessive. Here's something important. Phenotypes are not proof of ethnic origins. Blonde hair and blue eyes do not always a Scandinavian make, and red hair doesn't belong only to Irish. So what can a DNA test really tell you? Well, it can really tell you if a person is your biological parent, provided that parent has also taken a DNA test. It can tell you a biological sibling, if they've taken a test. It can tell you your half-siblings and first cousins. It can even give you a hint to your ethnicity, but not pinpoint exact percentages. That is a science that no matter how often DNA tests give you percentages, they are not truly accurate. But a DNA test cannot tell you your precise percentage of ethnicity. It cannot tell you exactly what your offsprings will look like, and it cannot tell you exactly which diseases you will certainly get or not get. This is often due to something called epigenetics. So there are three basic types of DNA tests. They are the mitochondrial, the Y chromosome, and the autosomal. So let's talk about the mitochondrial. Mitochondrial DNA is a small circular chromosome found inside the mitochondria. The mitochondria, and thus the mitochondrial DNA, are passed only from a mother to her offsprings. So, a mitochondrial DNA test will tell you your female lineage going directly back from your mother to her mother to her mother to her mother, etc., all the way to the very first woman in your long line of female ancestors. What it cannot show you is all the lines that came in besides a direct matrilineal line. For example, it can't tell you much about or anything at all about your mama's daddy's mom. Now, only males carry Y chromosomes, and only males can pass a Y chromosome to a male offspring. Therefore, a Y chromosome test only works on males. So the genes that my father carried on his Y chromosome can be passed to my brothers, but not to me or to my sisters. Therefore, if my father carried African or anything else on that Y chromosome, it will not show up on my DNA test because I can't take one because I don't have a Y chromosome, so no Y chromosome test for me. Now here is a real dilemma with the Y chromosome test. Let's say Frank up here carries a very distinct gene on his Y chromosome, which he passes to his son Willie. But Willie has no brothers and Willie has no sons. Willie only has 3 daughters, Eva, Mary, and Dorothy. Therefore, Willie cannot pass this unique gene to his daughters because they have no Y chromosome. So if Willie had some special ethnicity that was carried only on that Y chromosome gene, his daughters will not inherit that gene. That does not make what Willie is less of their heritage. It only means that it will not show up on a DNA test. The third type of test we want to talk about is an autosomal DNA test. In the nucleus of each cell, there are 23 pairs of chromosomes. Autosomal DNA refers to the DNA that's inherited from the autosomal chromosomes, or the 22 chromosome pairs that do not determine whether you'll be born as a male or a female. We each have 23 chromosome pairs. 22 of those are autosomal. Each pair of chromosomes carries one from each parent. So the 22 autosomal pairs carry contributions from both parents and some of the people that came before them, like your grandparents and your great-grandparents, etc. So an autosomal test looks at the DNA which is not carried on the X or Y chromosome. Autosomal tests can tell you a little about each of your parents' origins, but they're not really accurate past 5 or 6 generations. And making things a little more complicated is the fact that some DNA washes out after 2 or 3 generations, while some last for hundreds of years. Let me explain. So for all those who want to know, where's my Native American DNA? Well, check out what I'm about to tell you. And remember, this is just a prototype. These numbers are random, but the way DNA mixes up with each generation is totally unpredictable. And it's hard to say what DNA you're going to get from what parent and what's going to show up on that autosomal test. So for the sake of this little model, we're using percentages, although scientifically percentages are not accurate. But to simplify, we're using the percentages, which is exactly what the DNA companies do sometimes. They use percentages just to simplify. So let's say that your great-grandfather was 100% German, and he married your great-grandmother who was 100% Native American and grew up on the reservation. And then they had a daughter. That would be your granny. And granny gets 50% German DNA from her dad because that's all he had to give her. And she gets 50% Native American DNA from her mom because that's all she had to give her. But then granny marries Papa. Papa is 50% Romanian and 50% English. And then they have your mama. Now, her mom, your granny, gives her 50% of her German DNA. And then from Papa, she gets 25% English and 25% Romanian. Yikes! She's growing up on the reservation like her mom and her grandmother, but she has absolutely no Native American DNA showing up on her autosomal test. So she marries Daddy. Daddy, your dad, pretend, is 50% Irish, 20% English, 25% German, 25% Native American, and 25% Italian. And then you're born. You get 50% of your mom's German DNA. And from both parents combined, you get 45% English. And then lo and behold, if you don't get dad's measly 5% Irish. So where's your Native American DNA? Are you no longer Native American, even though your mother, your grandmother, and your great-grandmother grew up on the reservation? Well, of course you still have Native American heritage. You just don't have Native American DNA. If you grew up in that culture, does that make you less Native American? I'd say absolutely not, because it's the life you've known. Sometimes genetics and what we're raised to believe about ourselves don't always add up. Legally, if your mother grew up on the reservation, and your grandmother and your great-grandmother, and maybe you too, you're still Native American. And even if you didn't grow up on the reservation, if you know you have a solid paper trail, or you have evidence and you knew your grandmother and you knew she was Native and she lived Native, and then possibly you could still consider yourself Native American or German or Romanian, because your Romanian great-grandfather's DNA is not showing up in you either. But suppose that you grew up in Romania and you grew up eating Romanian food and singing Romanian songs and wearing Romanian clothes, and you identified as a Romanian. Just because you don't have the DNA showing up, does that make you less Romanian? You had a Romanian grandfather. So what does that mean? It means that DNA alone cannot define who you are. Now, in this case, on the mitochondrial DNA, the Native American from great-great-grandma would still show up. But if the reverse were true, if your great-grandmother had been German and your great-grandfather had been Native American, and he had a daughter and no sons, then his Y chromosome might not show up in his female offsprings. I mean, that DNA, if it was carried on the Y chromosome, might not show up in his female offsprings. I hope that makes some little bit of sense. It's just that sometimes a DNA test won't show just everything, and you may have to take 2 or 3. I would suggest 3 DNA tests from 3 different companies, and possibly a mitochondrial and an autosomal. And if you're a male, I would do all 3 types. If you really want to know, you have to just keep digging. Remember this: the absence of proof is not the proof of absence. The percentages that are given on autosomal DNA tests are not scientific, and they're only estimates or guesses. Markers and a company that looks at history and the migration patterns of humans over the last few thousand years are more accurate, and they can't be attributed to percentages. So can a DNA test verify a family legend of Native American ancestry? Well, sometimes. Autosomal reports are only accurate for 5 or 6 generations. So even if you have a full-blood ancestor before then, or maybe a lot of full-blood ancestors before then, it may not show up on an autosomal test. It may not show up on the mitochondrial test, or it may not show up on the Y chromosome test. But if you take a multitude of tests, it's going to show up somewhere. And the best way to find it is through a third-party calculator. Now, any amount of Native American DNA that shows up on an autosomal test, or even Asian or Altaic or Siberian or Melanesian or Oceanic, if they consistently show up, or Middle Eastern, If they consistently show up, they could be signals to native ancestry. In 2014, DNA consultants did a study on Cherokee DNA, and in this study, they discovered that the Cherokee inside the koala boundary that they tested had DNA that looked more like Mediterranean populations, such as Iberian, Jewish, and North African, than they looked like other Native American groups. Keep in mind that testing companies don't have a good database on Native Americans, and Native Americans aren't real keen to have them digging up the bones of their grandparents to test for DNA, and I can't blame them. Some Native Americans living in the koala boundary have even less DNA than I do, but the paper trails are solid, and that's where your heritage is really at. Your DNA test is only a piece of evidence to help you put this ancestral puzzle together. Think of DNA tests as tools, as indicators, not absolutes. Don't take your 5% British Isles too literally, but rather say that you have some British ancestry, especially if it lines up with what you know to be true according to your research. Nothing takes the place of good old-fashioned sleuthing, at least not yet anyway. If you're satisfied with your one DNA test's ancestral results, it could be because you don't know enough to ask questions about the test. The companies selling the services, which is about 40 of them, don't share their data. Their methods, therefore, aren't truly validated by any independent group of scientists. There is no agreed upon standard for accuracy. If you send your DNA to different companies, you get different results. And I quote that from Sheldon Kremsky, author of Genetic Justice and the board chair of the Council for Responsible Genetics. Each company has its own database of DNA samples for current populations. From those databases, they each select certain alleles. In these spots, they use genetic variations called single nucleotide polymorphisms, or SNPs, as the basis for evaluating individuals. The SNP are chosen because they have different frequencies across different geographical populations. So they compare the SNPs with those most frequently associated with different populations in their reference database. Each company uses uses common genetic variations as a basis for saying the probability is that such and such a percentage of your DNA is from that particular area. They base this on how it compares to information in their database. Each one has a different database. So if you send your DNA to a second company, you get different results because it has different database. Now keep in mind that these databases are weighted heavily toward Europeans, at least at this time. So almost everybody gets a hefty dose of European. These companies don't use the majority of your DNA either. Your DNA contains millions of SNPs, or SNPs, but these test companies are looking at certain variations, and they account for a tiny speck that differentiate one human from another. So if a test says you're 50% European, really it can only report that half of those SNPs of your DNA look to be European. They're not 100% sure. If you get the Y chromosome or the mitochondrial test, you got to keep in mind that they are even less accurate because they test only one line. That means a lot of your DNA doesn't get looked at. However, for that one line, they are very accurate, but otherwise they leave a whole lot of stones unturned. Popular testing services use DNA from modern populations to draw conclusions about people who lived in those areas hundreds of years ago. We can't assume that particular SNPs used by the companies haven't changed in the past hundreds of years. I think if you really want to be matched with ancient peoples dating back past the last 5 or 6 generations, you have to test with a research company that's history focused, not monetary focused. Also, consider using a third-party calculator like GenomeLink or GEDmatch. I'm putting up here on the screen how to download your raw data from Ancestry and from 23andMe so that you can download that raw data, and then you can go over to gedmatch.com, or you can go to Genotation, Gene Plaza, or DNA.land, and you can upload your DNA there. And those calculators at GEDmatch are amazing. And so after that slide, I'm going to put up the links and references that I used. And then I'll also put those below so that you can click on them and read the articles that went into the making of this little video presentation. Not only doesn't Native American DNA often not show up, other types of DNA doesn't show up either. For example, I know beyond the shadow of a doubt that my great-grandfather was from Mexico. Yet, one of the companies I tested with showed me having absolutely no Mesoamerican DNA and no Spanish DNA, when my mother and father's haplogroups both go back to Spain. So, or actually my mom's goes back to the Basque region. I know beyond the shadow of a doubt that my great-great-grandfather was Mexican. So I asked my sister to test, I asked my brother to test, and then I tested with more than one company, and I uploaded it to GEDmatch. And guess what shows up in my siblings? Yep, you're right, Mesoamerican DNA. And they are my full brother and my full sister. And they have Mesoamerican DNA. And on GEDmatch, so do I. But with that one particular testing company, I didn't. I tested with 2-3 other companies, and every one of them gave me a huge dose of Iberian DNA. So, always ask questions. I sincerely hope this video is helpful. I ask you to click like and subscribe and help my channel to grow so I can make more videos on topics important to those of us who are interested in history and in genealogy and in understanding where we came from and how that affects who we are. Until next time, see ya.